Welcome to Sister Citizen Talks. This is a series produced by the Anna Julia Cooper Center with generous support from the Miss Foundation for Women and multiple units of Wake Forest University. Go Deeks!
And Higher Heights is the political home for Black women. We were founded 11 years ago, and we work to harness our power. And we already know that Black women are powerful beyond measure, but when we harness that power, we are really a force to be reckoned with.
We must change the lawmakers. And to change the lawmakers, we have to be the ones that are running for positions, from the very local positions to the highest offices in the land. And so
you want your brand to be. But I think that's the other thing I always say to people: understand who you are and what you want your brand to be, and make sure you do your business, accordingly.
If I want things to be different, they are different tomorrow. Right? And if I don't want things to be different, they will never, ever, ever be different.
I have been blessed to have so many Black women along the way pour into me. Michelle Martin, Audie Cornish, Yamisha's my homegirl. I've had so many. Eva McKinn, that's my bestie. I'm in a wedding. So I have had so many people really pour into me.
Your host for this series is Melissa Harris Perry. She is the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair at Wake Forest University and founder and president of the Anna Julia Cooper Center.
Hey everybody, it's Melissa Harris Perry, and thanks to Zach Bynum. Y'all have probably gotten to know his voice during our time together doing this series. As always, we are so thrilled that you have joined us, and this is the fifth and final event in our series, Sister Citizens, Conversations with Black Women in U.S. Politics and Media. Now, if you've missed any of the other four and you saw some of the highlights there, you can always head over to the Anna Julia Cooper Center Facebook page where you can find the previous events, or you can go to ajccenter.com and we'll have all of those previous events for you there. Now, as a reminder, if you haven't been following us before, just know that this is actually part of a class. It's part of a class I'm teaching this semester in my role as the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair at Wake Forest. And the title of the course is Black Women in U.S. Politics and Media. And so kind of think of this as like the public-facing aspect of the class. Sometimes you'll actually see the students in the background, and always you'll get to hear from the students. We always want you to amplify the events and share them with others. So you can do that using the hashtag Sister Citizen Talks. And we invite you always to be part of the conversation by posting questions or comments on our Facebook page. I also, before we get completely started here, want to say thanks again to the Ms. Foundation for Women, because the entire Sister Citizen series is made possible because of their generous support. So let's really get started. Now, I'm a little beside myself. I've been waiting through 4 events for this final event all semester. Joining us tonight is someone I think probably needs very little introduction, but it is worth noting that she is a New York Times bestselling author. She has hosted multiple shows on MSNBC, including the Reid Report, the first Black woman to solo anchor a primetime news show in 2020. Joy Reid has been host of the ReidOut on MSNBC. She's an author of multiple books, including the forthcoming Medgar and Myrlie, the love story that awakened America. She's the child of immigrants, a mother of 3, a graduate of Harvard University, a fearless journalist, writer, thinker, and talker. And Joy, welcome to Sister Citizen Talks.
MHP, you forgot to add yo homegirl, because I love you.
Listen,
nothing you can do about it.
Listen, I am Like, I feel like on the one hand, like, oh, we're in contact, we, like sort of connect. But I was like, oh, it actually has been a minute since we just, talked to each other. So I don't know. I know there's a camera rolling. We should probably watch what we say, but whatever.
Well, this is such a treat because it is like, this is my chance to have coffee with my sister. So I'm just excited that you invited me. I now want to watch all of them and binge watch all of these interviews because I'm watching all these phenomenal Black women go by. I'm like, oh my gosh, I know her. Oh, I love her. Oh, she's amazing. And I just love that you do this. And you know how I feel about the Anna Julia Cooper Center. You know how much I love it. So God bless and thank you for having me.
All right. And straight up, in case folks don't know how you feel about it, it is worth reminding that even though you're with us virtually here, this is actually the second time in a decade that you have sort of come to Wake Forest, right? And joined us at the Anna Julia Cooper Center. Way back in 2015, you came and you delivered this amazing talk, The Myth of Objectivity, How the Media Quest for Fairness and Balance Biases Coverage Against Outgroups. I mean, I remember that talk like it was yesterday. Now, almost a decade later, how are you thinking about issues of fairness and objectivity in mainstream legacy media?
Oh, wow. It's such a huge question. And by the way, that talk actually inspired me to teach a whole class that I wound up teaching at Syracuse. And they asked me to write a syllabus to come and teach in their journalism department. And I was like, that talk is what I want to teach. I want to teach, right, these journalism students to prepare them for a world in which, the pretense and the kind of phony false balance is the norm. And it is its own form of bias that has left out groups, particularly Black folks, because, racism is the train that's never late in America, and anti-Blackness is the train that is always on time, right? And so it is built so deeply into the discourse, and we're seeing it not just against Black people, but against other outgroups. I looked today at a chart that showed the difference in coverage between the deaths of Palestinians and the coverage of Israel, and Israel's point of view versus the Palestinian point of view. And it's not even close, including on my network, CNN, MSNBC, whichever you choose, you're seeing a huge disparity in the coverage that even mentions the Palestinian people versus the Israeli people. And both are suffering, and yet you wouldn't know it by watching most American coverage. I was recently overseas. It's very different overseas, where the coverage has a lot more inclusivity. It's not that there's no racism and there's no false balance and bias over there. It's just more comprehensive.
Yeah, and your point that it's not about it's not about a both sidesism and a kind of like, let's make all things equivalent in all stories, because not all things are equivalent in all stories, but it does have everything to do with standpoint. It's so funny, you were talking about looking at numbers. We were looking at some numbers in class around just sort of who counts as an expert, right? And which legacy media organizations, particularly radio and television, bother to put on anybody other than white men to be experts on these topics. And it's just like the difference is not close. Like it's not in the realm of close. You end up with something like 75 to 85% of solo interviews in broadcast are with white men. They are not 75 to 85% of the population, not 75 to 85% of experts.
That's right. And not only that, but white men are put on as the presumed neutral, right? Anyone who is not a white man is put on as somebody who is presumed by definition to not be able to be unbiased. So if you put a woman on, the presumption is that she's biased in favor of women. If you put a Black person on, the presumption is they're biased. And so therefore they can't give neutral coverage. So when you want like a generic neutral voice, they always go with white men as if they have no biases. And they set aside the fact that everyone has your personal biases, that the way you were raised, your religion, your culture, where you're from, your region. Are you Northern? Are you Southern? That inputs bias into all of us. And what we really want in journalism is not for people to pretend to have no soul as they're doing their stories, but to bring their experience to bear in their analysis. And Black women can do that just as well as white men, but we're presumed to only be relevant when the story is about Black people. We can't talk about Palestine and Israel. We can't talk about abortion. We can't talk about these other things that aren't directly about the Black experience because we are not an unbiased expert. But that's BS, as we all know, because we know people who are everything from rocket scientists to former school teachers. We can talk about anything.
Yeah, and worth noting, we're also not all the same. I mean, you could in fact you could in fact fill the entire Supreme Court, right? You could have 9 Black women on the court. You could have 9 queer Black women on the court.
That's right.
And it still wouldn't be 9-0 decisions, right? Like every once in a while there would be, but we in fact, right, have our own life experiences, generations, right? As you point out, sort of our places of origin, all of those things mattering. All right, so on this topic, I want to dig in a bit more with a question from one of my students. This is Colin. Let's take a listen.
Hi, my name's Colin. I'm a senior at Wake Forest University, and my question for you is, in an increasingly polarized political climate, how do you navigate the challenges of presenting balanced and objective reporting on your show while also addressing the very important social and political issues facing both Black women and minorities in general? Thanks.
It's a good question. And it's kind of the question, right? Especially since my show is a political show. The ReidOut is 90% politics. We do some foreign policy, but it's mostly politics. And my first kind of strategy is a strategy that I also shared with you, my dear, who was one of the first people to give me the opportunity to fill in for you on MSNBC. And I replicate your style of staffing. I have a very diverse staff. And Melissa, you always had the most diverse staff in the network. And I now have the most diverse staff and always have. All of my shows, I'm very intentional about making sure that if there's a type of voice out there that I can add to my show that's going to add to the diversity of the meeting. A lot of the time, the coverage decisions begin in the show meeting. And so I've been very intentional about making sure I have Black men on my team. It is the smallest group of producers, people who are something other than working in security or working in the kitchen. Nothing wrong with those jobs. But if you walk into NBC, that's most of where you see Black men. So I've been very intentional about saying, I need some Black men on my staff. I want to make sure I have Asian Americans on my staff. Some of you and I both know Kai Ma, who I picked from you and have kept her with me ever since. I wanted Kai
is everything. She wrote a script for me once and made it seem as though I knew something about boxing. I did not.
Oh, she loves a sport now. And, so Kai, right. And Kai also writes. She is an Asian American woman. She's of Korean background. Her family was in North Korea, partly still trapped there. She gives you that, but she also gives you the sports angle. Like, of all the people on my team, who's going to give me sports angle? It's going to be Kai. I make sure that I have young people and people who are a little bit more seasoned on the team. We want to have regional diversity on the team. So I've been very intentional about trying to build a staff that reflects all of the possible ideas and points of view possible. And then we hash it out in our 11 o'clock call to make sure that we've heard everything. And I am a person that wants to hear all the points of view so I can synthesize them, analyze them, and then reflect that in the coverage. Because my show, while it's a point of view show, is not a show just me giving my opinion. It's literally a group of producers coming up with facts, coming up with information, and then synthesizing and analyzing that from a point of view that, to me, it's not biased. It's actually the facts driven by all of our collective experiences.
I love that. And this is precisely for the Wake Forest students who are listening right now. It is worth noting this is exactly the editorial meeting conversation that we were having when we were talking about sort of how do these decisions get made. There's a sense that there's some one person up on high who's deciding it all, but it really is like who is sitting at your table or on your conference call. And this point about having the multiple voices, I am still, most proud of things that we did in Nerdland that weren't pitches from me, right? They were Jamil Smith, who is now running the world, or Tracy Curry or Kai Ma, or, folks who were bringing something that actually wasn't me. And those stories are the ones that I'm still the most proud of.
Yeah. Oscar nominee Tracy Curry, by the way. If y'all have not
Listen,
Get up on it. Okay.
Don't I know it? Look, Nerdland forever and freaking ever, because they have all gone on to do every wonderful thing.
Everything. Oh, and I still have my sweatshirt, by the way. I should have worn my sweatshirt on here because Nerdland was everything, y'all. There was a street sign on the second floor at 30 Rock. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, it is about that. I mean, before I was working on doing the TV shows, I worked at the Griot, and we were a staff of about a dozen Black people. But even as you said, we couldn't have been more different. We had every kind of idea and point of view. And some of the stories pitched were something I would have never thought of because, you know, the specific experience of this Black person and my experience growing up in Denver, Colorado are just very different. And so I think we have to think about diversity in a different way. It's not about putting one Black person in the room and saying that's diversity. It's about putting different people with different experiences, regardless of what that racial breakdown is, but making sure that that racial breakdown cannot be a room full of white people, because this country is multiracial. It's a struggling multiracial democracy. But the end game is a multiracial democracy, and we can't tell stories if we don't know these other points of view. I'm like you, some of the things that have been pitched that I wouldn't have known about, that I wouldn't have thought about, that we do on our show turn out to be some of the strongest segments.
Yep. So I want to dig back in the crates a little bit so folks know you're not just talking about this now, that you've been on this conversation. So this is from an interview that you did in 2018. And you were talking here about an eternal struggle. You were talking with the Women's Media Center. And at the time, you were talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates, Don Lemon, Van Jones being in the spotlight of journalism, while people like Tamron Hall and Sarah Sperry were exiting, needing more Soledad O'Brien's and April Ryan's, right? And that for women of color, it's still a struggle, an eternal struggle. Now, I found this and I had to laugh in part because obviously some of them brothers is out and Tamron is like living.
Yeah. Isn't it?
Yeah. So I want to we're on this now.
You know, it is this weird thing where there's a wheel that seems to turn when it comes to Blacks in media, where Black men and Black women are here on the wheel. I'm trying to keep myself on the camera, and we're going like this.
Yep.
They never allow it to be like this. There's always an ascendance of Black men in media and then an ascendance of Black women in media, but you very rarely see a sort of joint ascendance, because I think that there is still a sense that the Black point of view is threatening. I mean, I think about why Don Lemon is no longer at CNN. It's because he challenged Vivek Ramaswamy, and he was right. Yep. But because at that moment, CNN did not desire to have Republicans be challenged in that way, even though he was factually right, he was seen as threatening, and he was sort of portrayed as threatening. And that is the big risk Black men face, is that when they're assertive, they become threatening. For Black women, we have something like that as well. We're seen as aggressive if we are not sort of passive. And so there's always this sense that if we're not approximating what white people believe the right behavior is, there's always a double penalty for Black men and Black women. And we face it in different ways, but we still both face it. And I will tell you that as tough as that is, think about where Latinos are, where they just don't exist in media. Think about, as bad as it is for Latinos, think about Asian Americans who barely exist. Connie Chung is the last sort of major, Asian American news anchor we can all name. Think about if you are Palestinian.
Well, there was Ann Curry. We know what they did to her.
That's true. And you saw what happened to Ann Curry. And then you think about right now, we are, booking on these issues of what's happening in the Middle East. You can barely find a Palestinian American voice that is allowed to be authoritative and not constrained and told to be smaller and to not be biased, and that their experience is not seen as valuable. It's seen as biased and somehow threatening. So we're not the only, but we are, again, we're at the front of the tip of the spear when it comes to bias, Black folks. And so we experience it, and that's why we can empathize with other groups when it happens to them.
So as you're talking about sort of these connections, these experiences that we have, we're name checking this a little bit. And you also sort of mentioned, I was overseas recently. So can we talk about the machetes, because y'all was in Paris
Look.
doing all the things. And, if folks want to spend a little time like looking into who are the folks in this photo, it's a pretty fantastic group. But talk to me about why a group that includes these Black women matters. Like, what are y'all doing? And why does it matter to have each other's back in this way?
So the way, and Sunny Hostin is the 10th machete. She was not able to make it because she had a Lynx event, so she couldn't go. So the Lynx, come on, Lynx, you kept her back. She was supposed to go too. But the reason that we came together was that during the pandemic, we're all women in media, as you are, my sister. And it was a particularly trying time during, the whole pandemic, where everyone is working from home. Everyone's trying to figure out sort of what media becomes when we no longer have to go into an office, and just all of the various stressors of mass death, 1 million people dying, disproportionate death, at least initially in Black communities. It wound up being white Republicans who died disproportionately of COVID for a lot of reasons, but at first it was Black folk. And so a bunch of us wound up on a text group chat that had Black men and Black women in various parts of media. So of course, Tiffany Cross, my dear sister, who also we could talk about these issues, erasure from the mainstream conversation, which is a whole nother conversation, and that's my sister, Angela Rye, who I've known probably longer than anybody else in that group. Alicia Garza, who's just brilliant. Everything she says, I'm like, should I have written that down so that I
know
feel that?
I love her.
She's amazing. Brittany Patna Cunningham, Erin Haynes, who's a legendary, former AP reporter. Of course, Sunny Hostin, who we mentioned. Who am I miss? Carrie Champion. Jamel Hill and Carrie Champion, who are the greatest sports reporters, period, in the world. And so this whole group of us, we were all actually on a bigger group chat that had men and women. But you know what happens when you're in a mixed group? Sometimes you need some female energy. Sometimes it's a lot of male testosterone. And
you're like, let's jump over to this other sideline group chat right quick.
Side chat, just so that we can just sometimes breathe in just a sister space.
Oh, yes.
And so that's how the machetes were born. And there's a whole long story about why we're called the machetes. It has a lot to do with Sunny Hostin, because when I tell you that sister, she is sharp. She gonna come down with that machete, And so she's Afro Latino. So we ended up just sort of nicknaming ourselves machetes. And it was Tiffany Cross who, at one point, after we'd been, friends, and some of us had never actually met in person. Some of the folks I had only met because they were guests on my show. And so I knew them, but I didn't know them. We all knew each other, and some of us knew each other for a longer time. We all had different sort of levels of experience with each other. But Tiffany came up with the idea. She's like, we should really make a trip. We should all go and be on a trip together. So we went to Cabo, and all these—
I remember those first pictures.
Girl, the conspiracy, they were like, that's the Illuminati. Why are they together? Like, people started there was no conspiracy. It's literally a group chat that decided to make a trip. And then it just became a support for us. And we are just, I mean, I only have one sister, but now I have, 11 when I count these girls. Well, 12, I count you, my love. But I have found that having, and I love that you talk about the sister circle. It is a thing that is separate, distinct, and as important as our circle of Black folks that support us and Black family, because it is, they just get what it's like to be in a public space and to be constantly in the public eye and taking the arrows that means, and also the opportunities that gives. Right. You just get it in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's so valuable. It's like the person you don't want to be in the world is the person making a good salary with a, really valuable platform, complaining about the challenges, right? That no one wants to be that person in the world. I mean, some people do, but we don't want to be that person in the world, right? That's not what we're trying to be. But you do need to be able to talk about what does it feel like to you log on and just post, hey, it's Tuesday. And people are like, I'm gonna rape and kill you. And you're like, oh, that seems like too much, sir. That seems like more than a response to it's Tuesday needs to be. So and it's really about having that conversation. All right. So we talked a little bit about the diverse groups in an editorial. We've talked about the sister circle. I've got a question from another student. This is from Marge, and she wants to know about thinking about your audiences as well. Let's listen to Marge.
Hi, my name is Marge, and I'm a grad student at Wake Forest. My question is about bridging divides. In your episode on why is this happening, you talk about being a Gen Xer and the importance of building coalitions with opposition in certain instances. How do you balance that with appealing to more left-leaning, younger purists who view cooperation with Republicans as betrayal of their interests? Thank you.
Juicy question. These Wake Forest students are smart. That is a really fascinating question. But one of the ways that I kind of try to do that is that I don't do a show for a specific branch of the Democratic Party. I've just been a registered Democrat for a long time, but I don't consider myself to be working on their behalf. They on their own. I'm just here to give information. And I don't represent a branch of that party. And, if there is a Republican voice that is not fascist, I feel like they could be an audience for the show as well. What I do is we program this show to give a couple of buckets of what I think are really important information and things that we actually can do, what we can contribute. Number one, the defense of democracy. And I think the media has run away too much from the idea that we are a defender of democracy. That doesn't mean that we are we have to take a partisan point of view, or that we can't take the opposition seriously and not mock them and think of their ideas with seriousness. But we are a bulwark of the defense of democracy. We're the fourth estate. It's our job. So our sort of prime directive on the ReidOut is, what are the threats to democracy and how do we explain them? That does not mean I'm saying Republicans are bad because they're Republicans. My father leaned Republican, even though he wasn't really a horrible father. So maybe that says something about him. But, my mother was a Democrat. I grew up in a household, even though he wasn't necessarily there. But when he was there, they were on opposite sides. So I totally love the idea of debate. I love to debate. I have lots of friends that are Republicans and we don't agree. We disagree. Michael Steele and I will chop it up. We don't agree on much.
I love me some Michael Steele for conversation. I love me some Michael Steele. Yes.
Yeah, it's Sir Michael Singleton. I've got friends who are Republicans, so I just have a disrespect for the other side just based on the fact that they're on the other side. What I feel is that we are in a serious fight for our democracy. So that's job one. Yep. Job number two on the show is to illuminate issues of racial inequity. Because again, there aren't a lot of Black folk who have the platform. So those of us who have it, I feel it is an obligation to do that. And then the third thing, and I know I shared this with you, sis, is to highlight injustice. Because again, why have the platform? Ta-Nehisi Coates and I recently had this conversation. It's risky sometimes to highlight injustices that are unpopular to talk about, but if we don't do it, it's not like everyone else is doing it. So I think if I do those three things, it's not about me setting myself in opposition to people who are politically on the other side of me and vote differently from me, but I just take everything and I filter them through those three lenses. Is this about injustice? Is this about racial and also gender equity? I will put gender equity in there as well, because that's under threat too. We're looking at the Handmaid's Tale maybe coming down on us. So I think in those four buckets, I feel like I'm operating in a safe space where I'm not just a simple partisan hack. I'm literally just here trying to illuminate those four things.
I tell you what, as a 50-year-old woman who's no longer in her reproductive years, I figure if we're in Handmaid's Tale, that's why I'm out getting my farming life together, because they're gonna send me straight to the colonies.
Look, I'm trying to be not in my reproductive years, because I'm in my 50s and I'm still in the game. I'm like, come on, Menopause, what are you waiting for?
Oh,
come get me.
Let me tell you. It will be the end of sleep. Just go ahead and pause, because whenever it shows up is fine, because I really have not slept in 2 years. Woo. All right. Joy, on this question of taking the unpopular stances, let's take a listen to something that you had the courage to jump into this contentious moment of public discourse around Israel's attack on Palestine. Let's take a listen.
Sometimes in this journalism business, it is hard to get the words exactly right, particularly in a situation that is complex and layered, which evokes so much deep emotion and conflict, and where people's lives are literally at stake. How does bombing a densely populated land strip filled 50% with children constitute self-defense? How does bombing hospitals, churches, mosques, and UN schools constitute self-defense?
All right. I'm not going to ask the question here. I'm going to let one of my students do it. Let's hear from Nick.
Hi, my name is Nick. I'm a senior at Wake Forest University, and my question is, how do you think about legacy media's historical relationship with the anti-war movement, and what responsibilities do you think the media has in reporting on the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Another excellent question. I think that the problem with the American media, going all the way back to World War II, which was the first war in which, World War I was a little bit of it as well. And all of our wars have been filled with government propaganda. But when, newsreels were used during World War II to sort of whip up support for war, is that the relationship between the media and the government is incredibly unhealthy in times of war. We saw that throughout all of our wars. In Vietnam, the code was cracked because Walter Cronkite, who was seen as the most neutral journalist ever in history, cracked it when he said, this war is unwinnable. This war can't be won, and this war should no longer be fought. That was not some left-wing liberal journalist who said it. It was Walter Cronkite who said it. And that sort of, woke a lot of people up to the fact that the media has long been used by governments. I mean, openly during the Gulf War. The idea of embedding was invented during the Gulf War, where they said, we'll just take you with us, journalists, and you'll see the war from our soldiers' point of view. So you'll have total empathy for our point of view. We then fast forward to Iraq, and our government outright lied to us about the reasons for the war. We are going to war against Iraq and being told they had weapons of mass destruction and that it had something to do with 9/11. That was not true. But like 70 some odd % of Americans believed it. We bombed Afghanistan. Lo and behold, it turned out Osama bin Laden was not in Afghanistan. He was in Pakistan. And the way we got him was not by bombing Afghanistan into dust. It was by using special forces. And then half a dozen guys got him in Pakistan. The challenge was laid out for us by Dwight Eisenhower when he said the military industrial complex is dangerous in that it creates an incentive for war. Yeah. Recently, Mitch McConnell said the quiet part out loud when he said everyone should support funding for Ukraine and Israel, because not for the core sort of, moral reasons that Biden tries to put out, but because it's great for our economy. That all of those ships and bombs and things are going to be made in the American heartland, and it's going to be great for our economy. Oops, that's the military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. And so my take on war in general has been to be deeply skeptical of governments, and that we should be deeply skeptical of governments, their incentives, their motives when they go to war. And that doesn't just include our government. When we're looking at analyzing what a foreign government is doing, we should be even more skeptical. And so the idea that we would take at face value anything that the government of a foreign country, Israel, which, for some people, if you are Jewish, it is the state of Israel is deeply personal to you. But for journalists, it is a nation state. It is not an idea. It is not a people. Jewish people live all over the world. It is literally a nation state with a parliament, with a Knesset and a prime minister and a president. And they should be analyzed from a point of view of journalistic skepticism. What I'm concerned about in this situation, as in all the previous ones, is that journalists are not only, but for the most part, being told to cover this war as embeds, meaning you have to go along with the IDF, the Jewish Defense Forces. You have to show your footage to the IDF before you can broadcast it, though allegedly they don't look at the packages. Those packages then are essentially propagandistic because they are not independent journalists just looking and seeing what's happening. And so what's happening is that younger people who generally don't watch cable news are not getting their information from the, very carefully crafted IDF screened videos. They're getting them from people who are brave enough to be in Gaza and turn their cameras on, or there's some journalists from Reuters and AP, and they are turning their cameras on, and a lot of them are dying. This has been the largest number of journalists killed in a war ever. There have been more bombs dropped in Gaza than have been dropped in Ukraine, and that is in a much shorter period of time, in 40 days. So this is an incredibly deadly war. And so for me, I approach whatever the Israeli government says with as much skepticism as I have toward the Biden administration, because when the Biden administration speaks, they later sometimes have to update what President Biden says because it turns out not to check out. And that is common in warfare situations where we don't really truly understand their motives. So I wish we were treating this conflict the way that journalists ought to treat it, which is with extreme skepticism of everything that both governments are saying, and with listening equally to the voices of the anti-war movement, who've never gotten a full hearing from the American media, not in Iraq, not in Vietnam, not ever. And the anti-war voices are an equally important part of the story. And so the struggle, especially when it's such a sensitive issue, which this is that we have to find a way to treat the story with skepticism and somehow treat it with some kind of balance. And I see it. I don't see, to me, I feel like 10 years from now, there are going to be a lot of journalists writing woeful op-eds in the New York Times, lamenting the fact that the media missed another massacre, that the media somehow missed another Rwanda. And they're going to wonder, how could that have happened? Well, it happened the same way it keeps happening, because the media has a narrative they want to give, and they give it, and it just weirdly enough happens to coincide with governmental narrative.
Is that different than our coverage, and I mean our in the broadest sense of the American mainstream broadcast media, of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which also was pretty one-sided pro-Ukraine?
Very much so, very different. And the reason, again, is because our governmental position, the US government is positioned against Russia. And so for the American media, which did wall-to-wall coverage of Ukraine until it stopped doing that, and suddenly Ukraine is no longer essentially in the news media at all. But while it was hot, when CNN was getting huge numbers for it, and MSNBC was as well, and Fox, they covered Ukraine wall to wall. But other than Fox, which tends to be positioned more pro-Putin because Trump is pro-Putin, CNN and MSNBC covered it wall to wall with a very clear bad guy, Russia. But here's my challenge to the media. In both of these two cases, a nuclear armed superpower is occupying a group of people. In the case of Russia, Russia is occupying, and has been since 2014, parts of Ukraine, the Donbass region in the east, which they claim should be part of Russia, and Crimea, which they've already taken since 2014. That occupation is treated as illegal. In the case of Israel, which is also a nuclear armed superpower in their region, they are occupying the West Bank and Gaza. But we don't treat that occupation. We don't even talk about it for the most part in American media, or unless it's in a glancing way. In the case of Ukraine, the bombing of schools, hospitals, and apartment buildings is treated as a war crime and stated by American press as a war crime. And that is what the UN says. The UN also says the same about bombing hospitals, schools, including UN schools in Gaza, but that's not the way the American media portrays it. Because again, and this goes back to what you were saying before, Melissa, is the question of who is a victim, a legitimate victim, and who is a legitimate hero. It is very different depending on the point of view and depending on the person you're talking about. And unfortunately for Arabs and Muslims, they have been cast as a generic villain for so long in American media that I think the American media has a hard time turning and looking at even Arab and Muslim and also Arab Christian children as victims. They just don't see them. They're invisible. When Ukrainian babies are killed in a bombing, it's clear to Americans that is a tragedy. For some reason, when Palestinian children and I saw one story about the potential hostage exchange that said that the deal would exchange Israeli women and children for Palestinian women and youth. They're not children. And that was an AP story. So there's just even the subtle ways. And I think for African Americans, for Black folks, American Blacks,
we recognize
that, right? We are not children. I remember Tamir Rice was described in news stories as a young man.
Yeah.
That boy was 12. That's
12
not
years
a
old.
man. That's a child. And so that was a fight in turn. You know what I mean? I need to describe him as that's a child.
Yeah, he was he was
And so you know what I mean? And so I think and I think a lot of people do not understand why there is this instant affinity between a lot of young Black folk and Palestinians. It's people don't understand it because they don't see the world from our point of view. When Black folks look at occupation, meaning that an apartheid, which is what Jimmy Carter and John Kerry and the, even Israeli human rights organizations have described the West Bank as. When they were like, you can only use this road and you have to use this road. You can have these jobs, you can have these jobs. You have to live here, you have to live there. You can be booted out of your house and pulled out by armed settlers at any moment and lose your place to live and driven. We recognize that as Black people and as Africans. Africans recognize that, and Black Americans recognize that, and all the African diaspora, we see what that is. And so that is the value of our presence in this, at this table, because no one else is going to do it other than, my wonderful colleagues, Ayman Mohyeddin, Mehdi Hassan, Ali Velshi, to me are the MVPs of the coverage here, because they can ask the questions from a point of view that is so erased and invisible in this story that I think, thank God they're there.
Right. Well, right. Du Bois called it the second sight, right? That life behind the veil leads to this second sight. And even as you're talking about it, Joy, I'm remembering this post that you put, I think on Facebook or IG, when your son turned 23. And it was just like a, mother's happy birthday post, but it was also, he turned 23 just days, right? You'll see here it was June 16th, 2020. So we're talking weeks after the murder of George Floyd. And, you're just telling us who he is, right? This is who he actually is. This is what he's done. He's hilarious, right? Mm-hmm. And then this, I pray that he never encounters police for any reason, even a bland traffic stop, because he can be stubborn and he'll argue. And I have long feared that some officer having a bad day will take him from me. And I feel like, Joy, that's precisely that second sight, that vision of what it looks like to lose our children. So I can feel it for the Israelis' families whose loved ones are still held hostage, whose loved ones were murdered, right? At a concert. I can feel it. I can feel it for the young people in Ukraine who were living one life and then it was taken overnight. And I can feel it for Palestinian families. I can, right?
And that, the hardest thing about my job is that I can't stand to see children cry, because it makes me instantly cry. And I have always had this vow not to try to cry, not to cry on TV. But, when those little babies were slaughtered in Uvalde, or in Connecticut, when those kids were killed in that high school in Florida, who just reminded me of my kids. They had the same shtick, white, Black, brown. They all say the same, they say the same memes. They say the same things. They remind me so much of my kids, and to me, exactly, the Ukrainian kids, when you saw them, in the street with a doll, with their mom is dead. And, I see that. And again, right, kids at a concert, they just went out to go and be free and enjoy a concert. They're gone. And these babies, these kids, an infant in an incubator screaming. They have no mom. They're in an incubator together to keep warm because there's no more fuel to be able to power the incubator. All of it, to me, it makes my blood boil, and it makes me want to cry. And I feel tragedy, and I just don't and cannot understand how people can't see every child that way. And my mind can't wrap around how people only see some kids and some children as victims. I've seen posts, and I should never read the comments on posts, where people say things like, all those children are innocent. Those people voted for Hamas. They're kids.
Right.
They're kids. And how you cannot have empathy for them because you are tied and connected to a government and to one country. Every child in the world deserves your empathy. And to me, it's the thing that's been the saddest to me about this job is finding out how little empathy so many people have for other people. It's shocking.
The most brutal photographs of the sort of series of Emmett Till photographs for me isn't even the images of the brutality that was enacted on his 14-year-old body, as horrifying as those are. The hardest images for me to see are the ones of the wives of the men who killed this child, who are themselves mothers of young sons, standing in that courtroom after they are found not guilty and laughing. And though I have spent over the years so much time with those, trying to understand where that comes from, that you could know that your husband murdered a child, and that you could stand and laugh in the courtroom when he's found not guilty.
When I taught my class at Syracuse, what I would do with my poor wonderful students is I would start with lynching and work my way from there.
Poor babies.
First of all, I would give my lecture from age. I give the lecture that I gave to you guys. I actually shorten that lecture and would give it as that's the first thing I would do. But then my second thing was I would go to right to lynching. And I would tell my students, I'm like, I'm doing this. It's shock value, but it's also because I want you to learn how to look at a photo of a lynching. Don't look at the body. Ignore the body.
Right. Look at the people looking at the camera.
That's right. Look at the people looking at the camera, because again, they're not turning their backs. They're not ashamed. They're not hiding their faces. They're looking and smiling. And they're smiling with their kids. Their kids are smiling. They're enjoying it. Know that they took souvenirs home, pieces of the body. There are people right now who have in their homes artifacts of lynchings, noses, ears, lips, fingers of lynched bodies. And postcards that celebrated the lynching. The reason Ida B. Wells, erupted at the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune was because they were covering lynchings like a matter of fact, everyday thing, and presuming the dead was guilty, that the dead man, dead woman, dead child was guilty, and they just presumed that, and then said this lynching happened and didn't have there was no emotion in it. And she was saying, no, there was a villain and there was a victim here. And our history in this country is that it was perfectly legal to kill Black people until at least the 1960s. And really, honestly, you didn't see anyone convicted for killing a Black person until kind of the 80s and 90s. It was perfectly legal for hundreds of years for any white person to kill any Black person they wanted. Perfectly legal. When you grow up in a country and live in a system in which your life can be taken not just by the police, right? Trayvon Martin, but by anybody.
Yep.
Anybody white. It changes how you see the whole world. And I think that is why Black folks have a certain special kind of empathy and a certain kind of an attitude around death and around killing, because we have been a non-person for 7/8 of this country's history.
I have one last serious one to ask you, and this is, you are smarter than the average bear. Whenever people are like, oh, I love Joy's show, I was like, y'all don't even know how smart she really is. That's just the cable news part of Joy Reid, if you really knew it all. So you have written a couple books, and you have another one coming out in February, and the one so you did Fracture, and then you gave us your Trump book, and now you've got Medgar and Myrlie, really looking at Medgar Evers, looking at their love story, which is both about their love for one another, but also their love for Black people. And it feels critical to me, like their love for the country, right? Their willingness to try to make America into what America is meant to have been. Why these two? Why this story?
And their love for Mississippi. I mean, Medgar Evers loved Mississippi. Weirdly enough, I loved it. I mean, he did think about leaving. There were a couple times when he said, he and his brother bought land in Brazil, and they thought about maybe moving. And there was a few they were ephemeral. Like, he loved Mississippi because he's like, this is where I can farm and fish and do the things I love to do. Open air. I don't want to live in a crowded city. I want to live in the country. And the reason I did it is in part because of my love for Myrlie Evers Williams. I met Myrlie as a result. This is one of the blessings of my show, is I get to meet amazing people. It's a great job. It's a horrific job in that I have to see a lot of horrific things, but I get to meet awesome people. It's how I met you, my love. I get to meet cool people. And so one day I got a chance to interview Myrlie Evers. I think it was on the occasion of close to her birthday. We were trying to celebrate her. And she shows up in LA at the studio with a big New York Times picture with me on it and says, I love your show. Will you sign this? And I almost fell off the chair. And
Oh no, I'd be done for life. I'd be like, you know what? I'm good.
I was like, I
I'm
retired.
good.
I'm hereby retired. Myrlie Evers knows who I am and watches my show. Now I'm nervous to ever do another show because that means she's been watching. And I signed it. And I said, first of all, you should sign something for me because you are a legend. And we just had the most wonderful chat, and I just fell in love with her. And so, I think in passing, I talked about, she's written 2 incredible memoirs. And also Manning Marable helped to write, her husband's, but it's not his memoir. It's really a collection of his papers. So there's been a lot. But when she got to talking, when we were just chatting offset, she started to talk about Medgar. And listen, I love my husband.
Like it was yesterday. Like it was yesterday. Like they was just at dinner. Yes, right.
I love my husband, Jason, Reid, love him. I have never met a person that loves a person like Myrlie Evers Williams, and God bless her other late husband, Mr. Williams, how she loves Medgar Evers. She even told Walter Williams, her second husband, you do know I'm still in love with Medgar Evers, right? And he was like, I'm good with it. I get it. I just want to be there.
That's fine. I can come in second to Medgar. That seems fine.
She is still madly in love with this man as if he is still alive. And I've never seen anything like that. And so when when the folks at HarperCollins were like, what's the next book you want to write? I was like, I want to write about that love. Because one of the things I feel is missing from books about the civil rights era is, number one, the women.
Yeah.
These men were not just floating around giving speeches. Their wives were their cook, their maid. They were cooking for all the civil rights.
Their strategist, their typist, their organizer. Yes.
Literally. Yes. She literally worked for him. When they left college, she left before she had got her degree, went with him to Mound Bayou, Mississippi, which she hated because she was like, it's dusty and ain't nothing to do. And she's a young teenage girl wanting to have fun, and she's stuck here. She was literally his typist. She even typed his papers. Remember, this was the 50s. She was a 50s housewife. So that means she typed his school papers. She had to also cook for him while they were in college. So the story of the women and also what they did and how that contributed to the movement, she's his secretary until she has 3 kids, and then she pulls out of that. But then she's his organist at the mass meetings. So it was a joint project, this civil rights thing, which she didn't want to even do. She didn't want anything to do with it. She just was in love with this man and just wanted her fine husband to be home. But instead, he was like off doing civil rights. And she was like, why can't you just be an insurance salesman? Why isn't that good? Why can't you just be a good dad? What's wrong with you? So she was not even with it. And then all of a sudden, this woman goes from being a reluctant civil rights wife to being the first national civil rights widow.
Yeah.
Before Malcolm died, he was the first to die. So she actually had to lay the groundwork for how to be as a civil rights widow. No one taught her. She learned from civil rights widows in Mississippi, who I name in the book to give them their flowers. She had to see of these local pastors who the world didn't know about, but she knew and they knew. And also she couldn't even learn from Mrs. Till because Mrs. Till wasn't burying her man. She was burying
her son, which is different. Yes.
Different. It's a different kind of grief and it's a different kind of mourning. So she had no one to learn from. And also, I don't think people understand Medgar Evers' important role in everything that happened in Mississippi, including those freedom rides. Who do you think was training those kids who were manning the civil rights struggle? The young people, he was the one doing it at the risk of losing his job. And people do not understand how bad the NAACP wanted to fire this man. And he was the first Mississippi field secretary. And I just feel like, how is there an airport named after someone that most people have really no idea what he did? His role in the Emmett Till trial, people generally don't know. So I'm like, I want to make him as well known as King and Malcolm, because he should be, you know what I mean? And so, and I also want her story to be viewed with as much sense of heroism as his, because she is just as much of a hero. James Baldwin said that these 3 men, Medgar, Malcolm, and Martin, were the triumvirate. Yeah. And so I'm like, I'm doing my part to make the triumvirate real and to make Miss Myrlie just as much of an important figure.
I also love that when you draw that connection about her relative reluctance, there's a little bit of the Michelle Obama, First Lady Obama story in that too, right? The relative reluctance. I will say you and I both have fascinating fathers, and my dad never said that the women were reluctant. He said his whole thing was, he said, the only reason any of us were in the movement was so that we could get laid. I mean, he was worse.
Can I just say something?
More graphic language than that.
Let me just tell everybody, since we're talking about stories, Melissa's daddy is I never thought my children would take a crawfish and put it in their mouths. My kids were so anti-bugs, and to me, those look like a bug. So I went down to Melissa Perry's house. Her father was in there. Come on over here, kids, and eat these crawfish. And I thought my kids were going to squeal and run away. 30 minutes later, my kids are popping their heads off. And I was like, who are these children? This man is an organizer. Okay, you want to say a civil rights organizer? He organized my kids to eat crawdaddies.
That party was so much fun. Oh my God. I had forgotten about that. That was good times.
They were just impressed because they got to meet Teray. Like they were just like, Teray is here.
Oh my God. Time is crazy. Can we just say that time is crazy? Because I think that's right. Oh, okay. So now I'm just going to have now I'm going to be able to sleep tonight because my subconscious is going to be doing all kinds of stuff. We're going to go into the speed round super fast. This is so super fast because you've been so gracious for the time. But speed round is a quick one. All right. Holidays are coming up.
Yes.
What has to be on your table at the holidays for it to truly feel to you like the holidays?
Curry, chicken, and roti.
I'm not going to have you do your daddy's accent. I do enjoy it when you do it, but I'm not going to have you do it. All right. Do you have a prediction for the Republican primary winner?
They should all go home. It's going to be Trump.
If for some reason President Biden were unable to complete the election cycle, do you believe that Vice President Harris can win the presidency?
I think America hates women fundamentally. So after the Hillary Clinton experience, I'm not sure there is a woman who could win unless she was extremely right wing. So I don't know.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, look, Joy Reid. How many times did I say Hillary Clinton can't win because America hates women? And people are like, what? Cake or pie?
Pie. Of course.
Of course. Because what are we even talking about?
Talking about
Joy? Yeah, of course. Joy Reid, thank you. Thank you for taking so much time with us. Thank you for being so open. Thank you for all of what you write and think and do and share. This is our last in this fall's series for Sister Citizens. So let me just take one more moment to say thank you to the team of the Anna Julia Cooper Center. Thank you to the Ms. Foundation. Thank you to all the campus partners at Wake Forest University, including the Department of Politics and International Affairs, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, African American Studies Program, the Women's Center, and the Program for Character in Leadership. I am Melissa Harris Perry, and this has been a Sister Citizen Talk with my sister, Joy Reid.
Thank you.
And Higher Heights is the political home for Black women. We were founded 11 years ago, and we work to harness our power. And we already know that Black women are powerful beyond measure, but when we harness that power, we are really a force to be reckoned with.
We must change the lawmakers. And to change the lawmakers, we have to be the ones that are running for positions, from the very local positions to the highest offices in the land. And so
you want your brand to be. But I think that's the other thing I always say to people: understand who you are and what you want your brand to be, and make sure you do your business, accordingly.
If I want things to be different, they are different tomorrow. Right? And if I don't want things to be different, they will never, ever, ever be different.
I have been blessed to have so many Black women along the way pour into me. Michelle Martin, Audie Cornish, Yamisha's my homegirl. I've had so many, Eva McKinn, that's my bestie. I'm in a wedding. So I have had so many people really pour into me.